Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And may I apologise for the delay. Apparently the chamber overran, and there's a rule which says that no one can come to events until the chamber closes because it might detract MSPs from more important business. So that's why you were held downstairs. Apologies. I'm Jeremy Peat, Director of the David Hume Institute. I'm not going to do any more than welcome you here tonight to thank our speaker, Paul Johnson, for yet again coming to see us, and to thank Charlie Jeffrey, who, as well as being one of our trustees, is the coordinator of the SRC programme for issues related to Scottish constitutional change, so as an ideal chairman. Paul is going to be talking about the Green Budget, talking about the public finances, and with some references across to Scottish issues. So I think it's going to be fascinating. We'll hear from Paul for 35-40 minutes. There'll then be good time for Q&A, and we'll stop in time to allow you to have a glass of wine, which you'll have earned by then, and still exit by 8 o'clock when I'm told the wine is taken away if you haven't drunk it. So be aware of that. So thank you, and over to you, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. This is now, I think, an annual ritual with Paul presenting the Green Budget. It's had a ritual which has had some extra bits interspersed recently, as Paul and his colleagues have said more about the Scottish debate, and the Green Budget will have a Scottish tinge in part, which we're really pleased to hear. Thanks also to the Scottish Parliament's Futures Forum as one of the co-sponsors for tonight, and I think the Futures Forum has had quite a history of supporting your appearances here, Paul. So you're very welcome on all of those grounds, and please do tell us about the Green Budget.
Thank you very much. I will. I'll come over here and be near the screen. So I'm going to say something as Jeremy and Charlie have said about the IFS Green Budget, which is our annual look at the state of the public finances and some of the options facing the Chancellor, which we published at the beginning of February with the UK budget due 2 weeks tomorrow. So I'm largely going to talk about the public finance aspects of that. If I've got time at the end, I want to say something about household incomes and about a couple of tax and spending issues that we've looked at, but let's see how time goes. And as you'll see, I've also included a little bit on Scottish public finances particularly. But let me start with a chart which those of you who have attended these events before may recognise, which is looking at the scale of the fiscal consolidation that this government is currently planning. So on the vertical axis here, you've got percentage of national income. On the horizontal axis, you've got years from 2010 through to 2018. And what that's telling you is that the government is planning to tighten public finances by 10% of national income, about £150 billion or so in today's terms. That's the scale of the consolidation, the fiscal consolidation that is planned over that nearly a decade now. So that's the first thing you'll see there. The second thing is you'll see the different colours. The blue is tax increases, the red is spending cuts. You'll see that tax increases only make about 15% of this total fiscal consolidation in response to the crisis. The rest comes from spending cuts. And the second thing you'll see is that we're not even halfway there in terms of the planned consolidation in total. And in terms of the planned spending cuts, we're only about a third of the way there in terms of public service spending. So a long way to go is the message of this. This, of course, is taking at face value what the Chancellor has said and laid out in his budgets and the last autumn statement about what he's planning to achieve. So where will that get us? Well, this is looking at it slightly differently. The red line is showing spending as a proportion of national income. The blue line is showing tax as a proportion of national income. You can see the problem, as it were, back in 2008-9, a very, very large gap between those two lines, something like 10% of national income in deficit, clearly not something that can be continued. The dotted red line, you'll see spending falling over this period as a proportion of national income. Now, the reason that this line shoots up here isn't because spending particularly suddenly took off, it's because national income shrank very fast. Spending plans continued as they were, so spending as a proportion of the total national cake went up. And what we're seeing over this period is a long period of trying to get it back down. So what you'll see is, even after all this consolidation, spending will still be roughly where it was in the mid-2000s as a proportion of national income. It'll be back down to where the last government got it about halfway through its second term. So not in any sense in total at very low levels. And you'll see tax actually there, as a proportion of national income, is forecast to be at its highest level since at least 1996, despite what I just showed you. So in a sense, you can see why you might have the shape of consolidation that I showed you. Where that gets you is spending and tax both roughly back to their sort of long-term average levels. Now, what the autumn statement said is, if you do all these things, we'll have a surplus of 0.1% of GDP at the end of this period. Now, that's not where we're going to end up. That's the numbers that spews out of the Treasury spreadsheets if they manage to achieve a set of spending cuts, which I will talk about in more detail in a moment. But that is what is planned currently by the current government if they continue in office until 2018-19. Just to illustrate, that's the gap that would have been there had no fiscal consolidation occurred. 10% of national income deficit in perpetuity is clearly not something that was feasible. So this is the detour, as it were, into the Scottish public finances. So what I've just shown you is what the world looks, or what the UK public finances look like, or what they're planned to look like. So what's the Scottish story? I'm not going to go into detail. We've done quite a lot of work at the IFS, which is available on our website, looking in detail at the tax and spending components of the Scottish public finances and how they differ from the rest of the UK. I just want to focus on the macro picture here. So until recently, the Scottish fiscal balance has been a little bit better, sometimes more than a little bit better than the rest of the UK, once you take account of oil revenues. So spending is higher in Scotland, but North Sea revenues made up for that, and indeed more than made up for it. But oil revenues have been doing badly over the last couple of years. The expectation is that the gap between spending and taxes will be slightly bigger in Scotland in 2012-13 than in the rest of the UK as a result of reduced oil revenues. And looking at what changed back in the autumn, of course, what I showed you was what the world looks like after the OBR increased its view about growth going forward, and therefore what tax revenues would be. Therefore, the world looks a little better in autumn 2013 to how it looked in budget 2013, because growth is expected to be more. So the OBR forecasts were more positive in December, but they were gloomier about the path of oil revenues. Now, I'll show you some different numbers on oil revenues, but in terms of the OBR's view, oil revenues, their forecast for them went down in the autumn relative to where they were a year ago. So again, this is showing the UK picture. This is showing net borrowing as a proportion of national income. The solid red line is what the OBR thought was the case back at the last budget in March, taking us to a deficit of 2% of national income by the end of the period. In the autumn statement, they thought we would be back. We would get to budget balance by the end of the period. Now, that is a combination of two things going on here. Over this period, this is higher growth. In the last year, it's because the Chancellor announced additional spending cuts in 2018-19. So put those two things together and you get the difference for the UK between those two lines. So the fiscal outlook looks better, but it is important to be clear that a lot of this opening up of the gap here is just because the Chancellor has said we're going to have another year of austerity in order to achieve that. So that's for the picture for the UK. What's the equivalent picture for Scotland? Well, you'll see, I think, three things of considerable interest here. First is, at the beginning of this period, in 2011-12, deficit in Scotland on GER's figures was significantly lower than in the rest of the UK. On current OBR projections, it's actually a little higher by 2013-14. And secondly, you'll see that the dotted line, which is the autumn statement numbers, actually a little worse in Scotland than the budget numbers, and that's because of what's the OBR at least thinks is happening to oil revenues. Go a bit further out, and the Scottish numbers again look better after the autumn statement, but really only after you take account of this additional set of spending cuts right at the end of the period. So through all of this period, essentially because of what the OBR expects to happen to oil revenues, the Scottish fiscal balance, having for quite some time been better than the UK fiscal balance, is looking like it will be somewhat worse than the rest of the UK fiscal balance. That last dotted line is what, so supposing independence occurs in 2016 and there are no further spending cuts, then you have the 5% of national income deficit. So in order to get here, you would have to continue along the plan set out by the current Chancellor. So that's the most up-to-date set of figures that we have on what it might look like. It, of course, depends on these oil revenue forecasts. I've said that they've looked worse. The OBR's view in March was that they would fall from more than 10 billion to 6 billion in 2012-13 and then carry on down towards 4 billion a year over this period. In December, they got even gloomier, taking us down to less than 4 billion. The Scottish Government takes a more optimistic view about where oil revenues might go. The difference between those numbers is significant in terms of the Scottish budget. I think the takeaway from this is not that we know what will happen. I think the takeaway is that to rely on the optimistic forecast is probably not an appropriately cautious way of thinking about what the actual fiscal balance is likely to be. And this is really just an illustration of the degree of volatility that is inevitable, I think, in revenues coming from something like oil, which are such an important part of the Scottish budget. So let me move back on to the UK picture. I've been talking about deficits so far. I've been talking about borrowing each year. I think my view now is that the bigger constraint actually is debt, the outstanding level of debt, rather than the annual level of borrowing, certainly if we get on anything like the kind of path that I've just described. This is showing national debt as a proportion of national income since 1996 through to 2018-19. You'll see that it was just under 40% of national income through most of that period. The last government had a rule that it shouldn't go above 40%, and indeed, just before the crisis, they forecast it wouldn't go above 39.9% or so, not a terribly cautious way of treating a fiscal rule. It will now hit 80%, and actually it will go higher than that. The ONS reclassified a bunch of stuff last week, which will push this number significantly higher even than that. So that I think is a debt at 80% of national income does begin to act as a significant constraint on what might be possible to do down the road. Is 80% of national income a big number? Well, it looks like a big number on that chart. It looks like a slightly less big number on this chart, which takes us back not to 1990s but to the 1850s. And you see there's obviously a long period of much higher national debt during and because of the two world wars. Other than that period, 80% of national income is the highest than it was highest since the middle of the 19th century. There are a set of different things going on in the economy in terms of the way that the economy was run over this period, which might make you think that it was easier to cope with that level of national debt then than it is now. But it is worth looking at it in that historical context. If you look in that historical context, it doesn't look quite so enormous. So I've talked about Scotland, and I've talked about this government's plan for the public finances. I'm now going to talk about the UK public finances and what do we know about what the opposition Labour Party has said about their view about what they might do about the public finances. The Chancellor has said that he wants to get to budget balance by 2018-19, and the chart that I showed you gave you some sense of how he might get there. What has the Labour Party said? Well, they've said something which sounds similar but is actually quite different. So they've said that the next Labour government will balance the books and deliver a surplus on the current budget. Now, that's the word current, which is different between what the opposition is saying and what the government is saying, because, of course, the current budget means excluding taking account of investment spending. Investment spending, about 26 billion a year. So in a sense, the opposition is saying we will be happy to run a deficit of 26 billion a year, or put it another way, have spending 26 billion a year higher or taxes 26 billion a year lower at the end of this period than would the government. And that seems to me to be the thing, the stuff of the next general election. This ought to be a central plank on which the different parties are fighting each other in the next general election. The current budget surplus, which the opposition is saying that it wants to achieve, is less constraining than an overall budget surplus. And what you're looking at here is a trade-off between the benefits of higher spending and lower taxes on the one hand, and higher borrowing and higher debt on the other. And that, it seems to me, is entirely the right kind of thing on which we ought to be having a political as well as an economic debate. It's not clear which is the better of these policies. They are different, though, and they will result in different outcomes. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the risks or uncertainties that surround some of the numbers that I've just been talking about. I've presented these numbers as if, this is where we're going to end up. Well, we know we're not going to end up where I've said, where the figures suggest. If you look back to 2010, the Chancellor then thought that we might be pretty much through sorting out the deficit by now. What went wrong? The economy went wrong. We haven't had anywhere near the growth that was hoped at the time. So, these are plans. They are nothing more than plans. I'm going to first talk about how big a consolidation might actually be required. I'm then going to say something about tax revenues and then rather more about spending cuts. So how big a fiscal consolidation do we actually need? Well, it actually depends on the size of this thing called the output gap. So the difference between where we are in terms of national income and where we could feasibly be, the amount of spare capacity in the economy. If there's a big output gap, that means that as the economy grows, the deficit will essentially disappear of its own accord. If there isn't an output gap, then the deficit is permanent, and you have to do the kind of stuff that I've just described in terms of a big consolidation. Now, the problem is that we don't know the size of the output gap. There's a lot of different views. The OBR thinks that the output gap's about just under 2% of national income. That's pretty close to the average of what forecasters think. If that's the case, then you need a pretty big fiscal consolidation. There are some people out there who are rather more miserable than the OBR. They think there's no output gap at all. Actually, we're back at trend. That requires a 10% of national income consolidation. That's just to get back where we were before the financial crisis. That's close to what's actually being planned. There are some optimistic people out there who think actually there's a big output gap. We will grow and continue to grow really quite strongly for quite a long time because there's an awful lot of spare capacity out there in the economy, reflecting the very poor growth we've had over the last few years. Now, if these optimistic guys are right, then we've pretty much done most of the consolidation that we need to do. If the pessimistic ones are right, then we need to do the full 10% that's being planned. The problem is we're not going to know the answer to this puzzle until after the event, and there really is a lot of uncertainty about this. So there's uncertainty on the upside here, because if there is a big output gap, then actually the scale of the consolidation that's being planned may not turn out to be necessary. So that's one issue. I'll now come on to one side of the fiscal balance, which is the tax. I'm just going to got one chart on this in terms of time. Obviously, whether we get back to, whether we approach that budget balance at the end of the period will depend on how much tax is actually raised. As the economy grows, you'd hope the amount of taxes that we raise continues to grow. The sorts of estimates that the OBR have of tax increases are fairly consistent with the sorts of increases we saw in tax revenues as the economy recovered in the 1990s. But there are two particular issues I think it's worth drawing attention to. The first is this set of capital taxes, which you see will be about 5% of all taxes by the end of this period, the highest they've ever been, actually. By capital taxes, I mean inheritance tax, stamp duty, and capital gains tax. About twice as much from them as a proportion of total revenues, as was the case 20 years ago. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty about that. Actually, forecasting things like capital gains tax and stamp duties is not straightforward. The second thing you'll see is we've got the three big taxes down here: income tax, national insurance contributions, and VAT. And you'll see that as we go through time, they become a bigger and bigger chunk of all taxes. So we're becoming more and more reliant on three very specific taxes. Now, that's not necessarily in any sense a bad thing. These are probably better, broader, and better designed taxes than a lot of the other taxes that we have. But we are becoming more reliant on these, and actually the forecasting of them then becomes particularly important. But not only are we becoming more reliant on those taxes, we're becoming more reliant on a very, very, very small number of people to pay a very, very large proportion of all of those taxes. So if you look at income tax, nearly 30% of income tax is paid by 1% of individuals, and indeed about 12% of it is paid by 0.1%. So there's about 30,000 individuals paying about 12% of all income tax, just those 30,000 people. So we're incredibly dependent on a very small number of extraordinarily rich individuals. If they change their behaviour, or their income goes down, or they get better at avoiding tax, or they leave the country, then that will have a massive effect on the public finances. Just the income tax paid by the top 1% is about 8% of all tax revenues, and then when you take into account the other taxes they're paying, it's particularly important. And this is one of the big differences between the UK and Scotland, actually, because most of these guys live in London, and that's why the income tax raises more per person in UK than it does in Scotland, because the income distribution in England is much wider than it is in Scotland. So we're saying the same sort of thing is also true of stamp duties. 1% of property transactions are responsible for about 30% of all stamp duty that is paid, and most of those property transactions are in London and the South East. So we're very dependent on a small number of people, and their behaviour will have a big effect on the amount of tax that we actually raise over the next few years. I could talk a lot more about taxes, but I'm going to move on to spending, which, as you saw, was where most of the action is in terms of change over the next few years. So what I showed you before was the scale of the consolidation and how spending was changing as a proportion of national income, and you saw it falling sharply as a proportion of national income. Well, actually, spending in real pounds terms, and this may surprise you, is not actually going down very much, and indeed over the next, from 2011 onwards, isn't really going down at all. So this is hundreds of millions of pounds up, hundreds of billions of pounds up here, and it's pretty flat at just over 700 billion pounds a year. How can that possibly be true, given all of the doom and gloom I've been spreading about all these terrible spending cuts that are happening? Well, what I'm going to do now is break this down and explain what's going on. So obviously, as national income rises, if spending stays at the same pounds level, spending is falling as a proportion of national income. But let's break this down. Well, one thing that's going on, of course, is that debt interest spending is going up, and it's going up by more than 20 billion a year. It's going up by about 50% over this period. Not surprising, there's an awful lot more debt around. So that's the first one. So non-debt interest spending, which I guess is the thing we care about because it actually buys stuff, is going down by about 50 billion or 7% over this period. So 7% is still not perhaps as big a number as you might have been expecting. So let's break that down. So why do we think of these as big spending cuts over this period? Well, within non-debt interest, you've got social security spending. Well, social security spending is actually going up over this period. It's going up by about 8.5%, by about 17 billion, despite, and this is despite the cuts that have already been, this is not taking account of the mooted additional cuts that the Chancellor suggested he'd like to have, because he hasn't actually announced what they would be or indeed committed to them. But social security spending is going up by about 17 billion over this period, largely because of pensioner benefits. Why are pensioner benefits going up? And I'm going to come on to this in a minute. So actually a very, very sharp increase in the number of pensioners over this period is the main reason. There's also an increase in the level of benefits that they're receiving on average. So if social security spending is going up, that means what's left for everything else has to go down even further, and that's going down by about 14% over this period, what we've called public service. So everything that isn't, effectively everything that isn't debt interest and social security spending is falling by about 14% over this period. What about that 14%? Now, actually, that's probably a smaller number than you were expecting, certainly if you've been listening to previous presentations that I've given. 14% is perhaps not such a big number. Well, within that, actually, what we normally think of as the departmental spending, so spending on education and health and local government and so on, is falling by 20%. Why the difference between those two things? Because other stuff, and this is basically public sector, public service pensions and payments to the EU and local authority self-finance spending, those are the three big bits there, they're rising. So departmental spending is going down by 20% over this period. So this is public service spending as we normally understand it falling by 20% over this period. If we continue to protect health, schools and aid, that's actually a cut of 36% in everything else. So what I've done there is break down what looked initially like a pretty flat level of spending and explained, as it were, why within that there are some really, really sharp spending cuts in a particular set of areas. So essentially, public services other than schools and health, so defence, local government, justice, transport, police, all of those kinds of things, on average, cuts of more than a third over that period. That is where those spending cuts come from. That's also why some people are saying, well, the government isn't really squeezing public spending. So if you looked at my initial line, it doesn't look like they are squeezing public spending. It's staying about flat in real terms. But because there are a whole bunch of things where they're spending more, because they're very much demand-driven, and there's a small number, there's this very important bit of public service spending where the cuts are really rather dramatic. Now, of course, that's a set of plans. They're not necessarily set in stone. As I've said, the Chancellor has mooted the possibility of cutting social security by 12 billion as a way of getting round some of this problem. Well, 12 billion is quite a big cut to social security on top of the cuts that have already happened. If pensioners continue to be protected, that's another 13% cut in all other bits of social security spending. It may be deliverable, but it's certainly not going to be painless. What would that achieve? Well, it would take us to this wonderful world in which the spending cuts on public services during the next Parliament are no more dramatic than they were during this Parliament. That's what a 12 billion cut in social security, or equivalently a 12 billion increase in taxes, would achieve. So just in order to keep the rate of pain, as it were, the same, you need to get that 12 billion pounds if you want to achieve what the Chancellor said he wants to achieve, which is budget balance by the end of the period. And then, of course, there's even more bad news, I'm afraid. One is that there are additional spending commitments which the government has made, which are not accounted for in any of these numbers. So there's another £7 billion. The government said, we will spend £7 billion extra on things like childcare, on free school meals, on social care, and on public sector pension, national insurance contributions, which is not taken account in any of that. So it's an extra few percent off all other spending. I'm not going to say any more about that. If I have time at the end, I'll say a little bit about childcare spending. But actually the other issue is demographic change. I've already mentioned the impact of demographic change on pension spending. But actually demographic change is quite big over this period. So across the UK, the population is growing by 5.5%, 3.5 million people between 2010 and 2018. That's a pretty big increase, and that's actually one of the things that's keeping tax revenues up. So the effect on tax revenues I've already taken account of in the figures that I've shown you. But what this means is that the impact on public service spending per head is rather bigger than the effect on public service spending in total. So public service spending is forecast to fall by about 1.7% a year over this period. Public service spending per person, which is perhaps what you might be more interested in, is falling more like 2.5% a year over this period. So the squeeze on public service spending is actually rather more significant even than those numbers would initially make you think, because there are just more people to look after. On top of that, there is the ageing of the population, and because we are finally getting to this point where the baby boomers are really beginning to hit retirement in big numbers, we're actually seeing a 20% increase in the population aged over 65 over the period between 2010 and 2018. That's a very, very fast rate of increase for the older population. I've already told you something about what that means for pension spending, but of course that means an effect on health spending as well. So there is a freeze in national health spending. That is being protected in real terms. But the effect is to have a real cut in per capita spending. So let me show you that on a chart. Here's health spending. It's flat over this period in total. Spending per person is dropping by about 5.5% over that period. Once you then adjust for the fact that the population is older, the age-adjusted spending per person is falling by about 9%. So even though we're protecting health spending, and as a result health spending is growing and growing as a proportion of total spending, the effective impact of what's happening is a 9% per person cut in the amount that we're spending on health. I'm not going to go through all of these other things that we've talked about in the Green Budget. I've got slides on several of them, but I'm just going to do one thing, I think, in the time that I've got, which is on household incomes, because that's clearly part of the very much part of the political debate at the moment. What is happening to household incomes? We know that growth has returned, and we're very grateful for that, but what's actually happening to household incomes? So, household incomes. Sorry, that was a rather sudden transition, wasn't it, from the public finance stuff? But I will plough on swiftly. So we've seen that what's happening to public spending is that it's going down. The public finances, hopefully partly helped by improved growth, are beginning to sort themselves out if we keep to some very dramatic spending cuts over the next few years. But what about how well off we're all feeling? Well, what's happening to household incomes? Well, partly an important part of this, of course, is what's happening to earnings. Earnings. We don't quite know what's happening to earnings. We're in this terrible position where we've got different sets of data which are telling us different stuff, which probably means that they're on the turn. They're probably beginning to grow faster than prices. The big picture, though, is that even if they are beginning to grow a bit faster than prices, they're a long way below where they were in October 2007 after taking account of prices. So we reckon they're about 8% lower than they were 7 years ago. Now, that's a pretty extraordinary period. We've never seen a period anything like that since at least the last war. Though on the very, very positive side, employment is very high. Employment is higher now than it was before the recession hit, which makes this a very equitable recession in some senses, and I'll come to that again in a moment. That's just earnings. What about incomes? Well, real incomes as a whole have gone down by about 6% below their pre-recession peak. Again, they're probably turning up around now. We can't be sure about that, but I would guess they're probably beginning to rise very slowly now. Just to illustrate how this has happened, look at the blue line, that's the median income. We have this data, we know for sure that's what happened over the period of 2011-12. We don't have good data after that yet, but we've simulated what we think has happened. So 5% fall then. We think on our simulations it continued to fall in 2012-13, but has probably turned around in 2013-14, a 6% fall overall. That's broadly what we think has happened to household incomes over this period. So far, the losses actually have been much bigger at the top of the distribution than at the bottom. So what are we doing here? We're looking at changes in income, and we're looking from the poorest 5% here all the way to the richest 5% up this end. And we're looking at the period from 2007 to 2013. And what's happened? Well, there's the 6% fall for the median, the person in the middle we just saw. But across here, you've got falls of about 2% for the poorest group and falls of about 10% for the richest group. So again, that's a pretty equitable looking picture. The rich really have been hit quite a lot harder than the poor. What's going on there? Well, earnings have fallen, so that affects people in work, and they're on this end of the distribution. Employment has risen. Taxes for these people right at the top have gone up a lot over this period. But at this end, the benefit cuts haven't really started to bite yet. So they're beginning to bite in 2013, they'll bite harder in 2014, they'll bite harder still in 2015. We have looked at where we think this will be by 2015. We think this will be a flat line by 2015 because earnings will start to rise at this end. Benefits cuts will bring people down at this end. So my guess is that if you take the period from 2007 to 2015, you'll get a flat line, in which case everyone's losing about 5% over that period. So that's the kind of big story in terms of household incomes. But let me say one more thing about that. We've heard a lot about the cost of living crisis. It's a strange word given that inflation has not been super high. I mean, we haven't had inflation at sort of 1970s or even 1990s levels over the last year. So in what sense is there a cost of living crisis? Well, what I just showed you was real changes assuming that everyone was faced the same level of inflation. That's the sort of thing that we usually assume. But actually there's been two big things that have affected different bits of the population. Clearly if you have a mortgage, you've got you've done quite well from having lower interest rates. And it tends to be better off people that have mortgages. If you spend a large proportion of your money on energy and food, where prices have gone up much quicker than prices on average, then you've done very badly. Who spends a large proportion of their money on energy and food? Well, people with not very much income. And what we have estimated sort of the effect of that, and if you take account of that, then you wipe out that apparent very redistributive effect over this period, because the price levels for poor people have gone up by a lot more than price levels for better off people on average. Clearly there's a lot of variation in there, but that effectively wipes out that differential that I showed you earlier. I'm probably going to stop there. I have quite a lot more that I could say. I've particularly got some stuff I wanted to say about childcare, but I think we're probably...
Do childcare, Paul.
I'll do childcare. Why am I going to do childcare? Because there's a consensus that we should spend more on it, and I don't like consensuses about spending more unless there's a very good reason for doing it. I don't mind spending more, but I don't like consensuses when they aren't very well evidenced. And I'm going to argue, as we do in the Green Budget document, that this is a very good example of a consensus which is not terribly well evidenced. Everybody, every main political party, this side of the border and the other side of the border, is very keen on spending lots more on childcare. Why? It's quite, given the current fiscal climate, I think it's quite an interesting thing. And I've got two problems with this. First is the lack of clarity about purpose. Some people talk about childcare, universal childcare, as a good way of promoting social mobility, because if you provide high quality childcare for children from poor backgrounds, that is good for them. That's absolutely true. But if you want to do that, providing universal care is an extraordinarily expensive and ineffective way of doing it. Most of the evidence of the effectiveness here comes from very expensive, very highly targeted policy. So this is a very different policy from a lot of the policies that people use in order to justify it. So that's point one. Second, which is quite surprising, is it may have an good effect on labour supply, but the evidence of this is remarkably poor. So this is something where this may be the right thing to do, but one really does need the evidence before the policy rather than assume the evidence, which I think is what is largely done at the moment. The second problem with this is the actual way we're spending this money at the moment, and I'm talking about £7 or £8 billion a year of spending on childcare. This is something that's increased very, very fast over the last 20 years under both governments. The way that it is currently designed is extremely complex and extremely poorly designed, and even more poorly understood. The actual effect of these policies on how childcare is delivered and how costs in childcare are taken account of is just not understood. So we have a set of free provision for children of different ages for a certain number of hours a week. And some of that's delivered publicly and some of that's delivered privately. We have a set of tax breaks, and we have some support through the benefit system with a very unclear way in which these things work together. And let me just show you one of my sort of classic IFS chart, as it were, about how this actually works. So for a particular kind of family, how much is the government going to contribute to their childcare costs? So this is for a two-earner family. First earner in work, earning about $15,000 a year. They've got 2 children. So over this period, they get 70% of their childcare costs paid. Over this period, 85%. Over this period, they're on a taper. Over this period, they get 20%. Of course, people's incomes change. I can't think of any rationale for a picture that looks like that. I think it's the first point. But secondly, people's incomes change across all of these places. This is very complex, very hard to understand, almost certainly doesn't have the kind of effects that you would hope that it would have. So this is just an example of why there may well be very good reasons for spending on childcare. There may be very good ways of doing it. We have neither had a sensible debate about the first, nor do we have a sensible way of doing the second. I've also got some stuff to say as another example of something we don't like, which is the debate on business rates at the moment. I won't go into it other than to say there's a lot of debate on business rates. It's a very poorly informed debate. This is something that raises $26 billion a year. It's a tax actually that was pretty stable for a very long period. We've now had a series of temporary changes which have become semi-permanent changes, delays, changes to the way that this thing is increased, all it seems tactical responses to short-term political problems which are making a right mess of what was not by any means a great tax, but this has made it a worse tax, not a better tax. This is not a good way of making policy on tax. So let me finish there by saying, there has been good news. We have had growth. There is a lot of fiscal consolidation still to come if we follow what this government, Conservative government, is doing, and quite a lot even if the Labour opposition in the UK wins out. There's a lot of uncertainty about all of that. The situation in Scotland has not got better in the same way that it has in the rest of the UK because of what appears to be happening to oil revenues. There's a lot of uncertainty, of course, about that. In terms of a lot of the political debate, we don't know exactly what's happening to household incomes right now, but we know pretty much for sure they're an awful lot lower than they were back in 2007. They may be beginning to rise over the next year or two. And I just gave you a very, very quick, and I'm sorry about that, explanation of why we still think there's space for an awful lot more common sense and rationality and evidence in both tax and spending debates, both in the UK as a whole and up here in Scotland. Thank you.
I said this is now an annual ritual. I presume it's an annual ritual to say that last sentence. That
Absolutely.
You would like more rationality in policy debate. Thank you very much, Paul. You've shown again that we're living through an extraordinary era, and I think what you said about spending plans and implications once you break it down are quite challenging. I think you've done it also with the typical IFS accessibility, both around big pictures and detailed policy issues like childcare, so thanks very much. We have about half an hour in which we can take thoughts and questions from the audience. We'd like to do so in the usual way by having people identify themselves, use the microphone and offer crisp and concise questions. One right at the back there. We'll go, all right, and then following at the front. Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas Ward. It does, from the evidence, it does seem sad but true that many voters in September in the Scottish independence decision will be voting on whether they think they may be £500 a year better off for the next 2 or 3 years. We may all have our views about that, but that's a lot of evidence seems to support that. When you have a look at the SNP prospectus for independence, or if the Office of Budget Responsibility were to have a look at it, what commentary would you give on it?
On whether people will be £500 a year better off or not?
In terms of the credibility of the tax and the spending projections put forward.
I haven't looked in detail at some of those things, but there are clearly some spending commitments in there, and not, as far as I can see, a lot in the way of tax increases proposed. This is common to political parties of all types, so I don't think the Scottish National Party is being in any way unusual in putting some of that forward. I think the what will happen post independence, I think is uncertain. I mean, is both uncertain and the counterfactual of being staying within the UK is clearly significantly uncertain. I think the chances of it making as much as £500 a year difference in either direction are pretty remote, to be honest.
Thank you very much. Please.
Yes, John Thibault from the Scottish Parliament. Thank you very much for such an informative speech. But I just wanted you sort of put out kind of a view of a tale of two cities, the sort of the happy Edinburgh and the kind of pessimistic London. And I just wanted to pick you up about sort of both of them. First of all, just with London, there's the Chancellor's kind of claim that there's going to be further spending cuts going right into 2018. And just how much do you think that's actually going to be politically deliverable, given the fact that most of the fat has probably already been cut off, to say there's going to be further spending cuts, and given the sort of the areas that have already been ring-fenced, just is that going to be deliverable at all? And second of all, just slightly picking up on the former point, with sort of the kind of view put forward by the SNP about what they're going to do with sort of an independent Scotland, are they not slightly hamstrung by, as you were pointing out, the lack of high-earning individuals who can sort of add to the income tax and also the capital taxes? And also slightly hamstrung by the fact that that cuts in things like your spending decreases because of your kind of anti-avoidance manoeuvres are going to be more difficult, given the fact that an independent Scotland will just be starting out with Revenue Scotland rather than have an established system like HMRC.
Yeah, those are good questions. On spending cuts, are they deliverable? I think it's hard to say. I think it has proved, I think, easier than many of us expected to deliver the cuts so far. So there have been significant cuts delivered so far, and indeed the government has overshot its own pretty ambitious targets. And there's been, as far as I can see, remarkably little political backlash on that. Now, that may be because, and indeed talking to people in various bits of the public sector, I suspect it was at least in part because there have been significant bits of, as you suggest, fat that could be cut. That's clearly going to get harder going forward. A second part of that, it's clear if you're going to make, let's think what these cuts mean. You can't make a large proportion of the cuts come in terms either of paying people in the public sector less or employing fewer people in the public sector. Now, to the extent you pay people in the public sector less, the rest of us might not notice that. So that's saving money, at least in the short run. The rest of us might not notice it. Clearly, those in the public sector will notice it. At some point, you can't keep paying them less. Now, because actually wages have done so badly in the private sector, wages in the public sector are still, relative to private sector wages, a little bit above where they were actually pre-recession. But if we have another couple of years of restraint, then public sector wages will fall below where they were relative to the private sector pre-recession, and you have to think about how far you can take that. Second thing is losing jobs. Now, we've lost an awful, I can't remember the numbers, 250,000 or something public sector jobs gone already. The numbers I just showed imply another 700,000 public sector jobs to go by 2018. Now, that's an awful lot of people, of jobs to go, and from that you can get a sense of the scale of the public service cuts that would be implied, and that may or may not be possible, but that's part of it. If you look at the amount of public service spending as a proportion of national income, as the Office of Budget Responsibility pointed out back in the autumn, by 2018 on these plans it does fall to its lowest level since effectively records began in 1948 as a proportion of national income, not in absolute terms. Though actually not ever so much below where it was in the late 1990s. Now, question as to whether that proved politically sustainable in the sense that a government pledged, or which indeed did raise spending very quickly after that, then came in. But in that sense, it's not massively different from where we were as a proportion of national income back in the late 1990s. But my guess is it will clearly be more difficult over the next few years. In terms of your second question about tax revenues, I don't know whether I would describe Scotland as hamstrung in the sense of having fewer of these very rich individuals. It means it's a different structure of receipts, and it certainly means, for example, that you can't get as much money from stamp duty as is the case in the rest of the country, unless you're going to charge more on the average transaction, and you can't get, and indeed Scotland doesn't get as much from stamp duty, and you can't get as much from income tax unless you have a higher rate, and indeed Scotland doesn't get as much from income tax, but it does get more from some of the consumption taxes and other taxes. We've done some work specifically on taxation, how you might think about designing tax in an independent Scotland. Well, most of the lessons which apply to the UK as a whole would apply to an independent Scotland, and there are certainly ways of making the tax system an awful lot more efficient than it is at the moment in the UK, and an independent Scotland has that opportunity. Now, a lot of those things that we at the IFS think will be efficient are not necessarily ones that would, we're not standing for election. So, these include extending widening the VAT base, increasing council tax on higher value properties and so on, not the sorts of things that get many politicians elected. But one thing that is clear, that if you have a small independent country, then two things apply to its tax system. First, the, in a sense, economically optimal tax levels will in a lot of areas be lower than they would be if they were part of a bigger country, because the opportunities for cross-border shopping or moving to the other country or moving corporates to the other country or whatever are bigger, and so the theoretically kind of optimal levels of tax in many of those areas will be lower. And second, and that's related to the fact that opportunities for avoidance will probably be greater because you'll have another jurisdiction on the doorstep. That does mean that for both the rest of UK and an independent Scotland, exactly how tax policy is made, to what extent there is tax competition between the two, could have quite a big effect on the way on tax revenues and the structure actually of the tax system.
Thank you. Gentleman there.
Hugh Andrew. One of the things that you didn't mention in your talk was quantitative easing, and one of the curiosities, one of the most unique circumstances we have at the moment, of course, is that there's 375 billion of money effectively printed in the UK economy. There's two questions that I have as well. One is, what is your prediction as to what will happen to this money that dare not speak its name? And the second, do you not find it rather curious that the Scottish National Party has not laid its claim to a proportionate share of the asset which quantitative easing currently represents to the government?
Blimey, I've never thought of that second question. There was a reason that I didn't talk about quantitative easing, which is that I was sticking very much to the fiscal rather than the monetary side of things. But I appreciate that quantitative easing rather muddies the fiscal monetary boundary. It is pretty, whenever I talk to anyone at the Bank of England or on the MPC, they are absolutely clear that that quantitative easing will be reversed, and that not to reverse it would undermine the credibility of the UK as in terms of its debt issuance. Now, how strong that argument is, I'm not sure. So if we get to 2025 or 2030 and we haven't reversed it, what the damage will be done, I'm no expert in terms of knowing what that would be. At the moment, all I can do is take the assurances of the Treasury and the bank that this will at some point be reversed. I'd have to think about your second question, because I say I really haven't thought about that before.
Okay, I think the lady right behind you then. Yeah.
Nasra Bradley from University Glasgow. I just have a question with regard to the current growth that has taken place. Mostly it's estimated to be consumption-driven growth. Where do you stand in terms of the current projection of fiscal consolidation versus, instead of sparking more investment-driven growth, be it through the public sector or through tax incentives that stimulate the private investment, which may actually reduce tax revenues? Where would IFS stand in those views, and what is your opinion of the current path that is being taken on fiscal consolidation?
So in terms of the growth that we've got now, my understanding, so when we did the Green Budget a month or 6 weeks ago, the most recent evidence suggested that last year's growth was very much consumption-driven. I think the ONS may have revised that, as they revise many things very frequently, to suggest that it was less household consumption-driven and a bit more investment-driven. And certainly all of the forecasters who think that growth will continue over the next few years are of the view that that will rebalance towards business investment over that period. And if it doesn't, then it will fizzle out, because there isn't, it can't continue to be entirely driven by consumer spending. Though to be clear, consumer spending is something like 60 odd % of the economy in the way that GDP is measured, so it's inevitably going to play a significant part in that. So the other part of your question was really the kind of the terribly difficult question, which is in a sense how can governments promote growth and in particular promote balanced growth. And I honestly think if governments knew the answer to that, they would do more of it. But I think but serious answer is in a lot of these areas, I think there are, and this is the stuff I think where there ought to be political debate where there isn't. There are a range of areas where actually governments do know how to create growth and don't do it. And they don't do it because there are trade-offs. So we know pretty much for sure that a very significant liberalisation of the planning rules would result in growth. But there would clearly be significant costs in terms of environment and amenity and so on. So that is a trade-off. We pretty much for sure that some significant reforms to the tax system to have a much wider VAT base, for example, relative to the current system would be good for growth. But there will be winners and losers from something like that. We know pretty much for sure that investing more money in building roads would be good for growth. But for very good reasons, people don't like roads kind of coming up behind their back garden. So I think there are a range of things there that actually we don't have enough debate about the balance. And then there are a range of things where we know that if we could get the education system right, it will be good for growth in the long run. But actually, we just we have never quite worked out how to get the education system right. But actually, that probably requires again more of a focus on some of that than we have had.
Thank you, Sherry.
Hi, Paul. Sherry Nicholl from the Scottish Parliament. You spoke of your views on universal childcare as an effective route to social mobility. I was just wondering if you had views on universal childcare as an effective route to improved productivity and output.
Well, it would be it would increase output if it increased the number of people in work. Now, what surprised me when we did this work is that the evidence on its effectiveness for resulting in large numbers of additional people in work is not ever so strong. That's not to say that it isn't effective, but the evidence at the moment isn't terribly strong. So I think I think this is one of those areas, as I said, where there is an assumption that this will work and that the evidence is good. But we don't know that, and I think there's a case for really understanding that more and understanding in particular what designs of spending or subsidy or tax relief are the most likely to be most effective in that dimension. Before where I see the debate at the moment, which is essentially it's almost become like one of those things like if we got more nurses or more policemen or whatever, it's a good thing. It's almost like if we got more spending, it's a good thing. But actually the design and the way that it's done seems to be much more important than the big numbers.
Is that a polite comment on the White Paper's statements around this issue, or a more generic statement?
It was generic. I mean, I'm talking. This is the same debate in London as it is in Edinburgh. I mean, everyone is saying let's chuck more money at this, without, it seems to me, a very clear understanding of the most effective way of doing that.
Okay, my name is Tumiche Mishaka. I work with the Poverty Alliance. One of the issues that you touched on is about the cuts in social security spending. And you mentioned actually 12 billion, the headline announcement had actually been 18 billion actually. But a lot of people feel that that was an attack on the poor in comparison to what other cuts are across the board. What's your view on that in terms of the fairness within the cuts agenda? Is it really an issue that is an attack on the poor as we know it? The second question also is about the impact, especially on people dependent on the welfare state. If people are suffering more, there's going to be more spending in health, there's going to be more spending in crime and law and order, there's going to be more spending. The cumulative effect of that is actually going to increase spending. If you are in a position of advising government, what would you advise them?
I always hate that question. What would you do? So you're right. Clearly, cutting spending on social security hits people on lower incomes hardest, almost by definition. The figures I showed in terms of the impact on the distribution of income so far didn't include very much of the cuts in social security spending that have been announced and will happen. A lot of those are happening this year and next year and the year after, and those will clearly result in drops in incomes among people towards the bottom of the income distribution. Now, I think three things I'd add to that. First, within that, there's been a very clear policy decision to protect pensioners, and so pension spending continues to rise. Secondly, it's always important to take a sort of longer-term view of some of this stuff. So there are some groups for whom benefits are falling and never rose, as it were. So particularly single unemployed people, people under 25 and so on, they didn't get much out of the last government, and they're seeing their benefits cut under this government. But those with children, for example, people on low earnings or low incomes with children, saw very, very, very large increases in benefits under the last government, and the cuts under this government have not taken them anywhere near back to where they were back in 1997. So it depends on your point of comparison. So, for example, low-earning people with children are worse off, have got lower benefits now than they had in 2007, but considerably higher benefits now than they had in 1997. So it depends on your point of comparison where you think that is. And then there have been a series of other kinds of cuts. I think some of the ways in which housing benefit has cut has not been as well designed as it might have been, shall we say. The way in which council tax benefit has been outside, certainly in England, has been localised and cut in all sorts of different ways, looks kind of complex and rather ineffective. And then finally, I think there are the sets of cuts which are impacting on people with on disability benefits of one kind or another, where the where the difficulty in delivery in delivering in a way which is both fair and seen to be fair is really very substantial. But because this is such a large part of the social security system, it seems to be not surprising that there is some kind of focus on that. But there's no doubt that that's a terribly, a very difficult and sensitive area for achieving some of those cuts. What is clear, as I said, those are the cuts that are already announced. To take the other actually the biggest cut is the change in of all in terms of money is the change in uprating. So they benefit something out 1% this year, next year, and the year after, relative to inflation of 2.5-3%. That's a big saving and that's a big cut, but a much less visible one in a sense. To save another 12 billion, clearly, rather like in public services, even harder. Of course, child benefit for better off people has been cut, which might be easier than cutting benefits for poorer people. So another 12 billion, digs even deeper into the structure of the system.
Charles Livingston of Brodie's. My question kind of builds on the previous two. The way the SNP have been selling their childcare policy as an independence-related issue rather than something they could do now is very much reliant on the dynamic effects that they claim increased childcare spending would have. Similarly, you can have negative dynamic effects from benefit cuts resulting in increased spending on or increased costs of crime, etc. I was just wondering, to what extent are the models that the OBR are using or that you're using or that anybody else is using, to what extent are they using dynamic modelling rather than static modelling? And related to that, to what extent is there scope for dynamic effects to make the picture better or worse than the models might suggest?
So the numbers I presented were kind of very sort of straightforward arithmetical static numbers. Dynamics clearly matter a lot in this. So for example, One of the things that we have seen is this very high level of employment over the last few years. At least in part, the difference between what we're experiencing now and what we experienced 25 years ago in the early 1980s when unemployment was much bigger. And that's certainly part of that's to do with the structure of the recession. Part of it is to do with the dynamic response to a very different structure of a social security system. So that clearly matters, and it matters a lot. You can see, for example, that the state pension age for women has risen from 60 to nearly 62 now over the last 4 years. And you can see, as a direct result of that, and we've shown this pretty convincingly, that the number of women aged 60 in work has therefore risen quite substantially. That is a dynamic effect of a policy impacting on a particular group of individuals. Equally, we know that there are dynamic effects from changing corporation tax, from income tax and benefits. So those things are significantly important. It's very rare, though, when those dynamic effects are bigger than the static effects. So the chances that spending on childcare pays for itself, at least in the short to medium run, are next to nil. Now, in the long run, in 30 years, you may change the structure of the economy in a way which has a bigger effect. But it's very rare that you see a dynamic effect which is bigger than the static effect. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Bill Roger. Actually, you almost preempted my question. I wanted to probe a bit on the sensitivity in a couple of areas, and one of them was pensions. I mean, obviously, this is changing the pension age is something which takes time to put through, but I wondered if you could quantify the kind of impacts that might have in terms of the public finances, perhaps towards the end of your period, with a view to some theoretical policy implications. And the second one was the extent to which the income tax is determined by this top 1%. What proportion of that 1% is hot money? How much of that is Russian billionaires who might choose no longer to reside in our wonderful country?
I don't know how much of that is Russian billionaires. I mean, so the top 1% encompasses, doctors and senior civil servants and other people who are going to be pretty static. So the top 1% is everyone over 150,000. So there are public sector workers in there, certainly plenty of doctors in there, and permanent secretaries and so on, heads for universities, who probably aren't going to go anywhere. And there are a bunch of professionals in London, so on, who probably aren't. But so it goes from 150,000 all the way up into the millions. And I think I can't remember. I think the top 0.1% that I talked about, I think, starts at about $1 million a year. I think. And I say that group who are responsible for more than 10, even that group, that 0.1%, that 30,000 individuals are responsible for more than 10% of income tax revenues. Now they're likely to be, they'll be mostly in the city. They will be pretty footloose, a lot of them, but I don't know how many of them are Russian billionaires. I don't know. So I think it's very important when we think about the rich. I think it's very kind of everyone thinks about the rich as someone who's a bit richer than they are. So it's important to think of actually someone on earning of sort of 50,000 or more is earning double the average salary. So they're rich in that sense, but many of them probably won't feel terribly rich. I was talking about the top 1% who are earning more than 150,000 a year. People often think though they're talking about people on $1 million a year, but it's important to be clear that they are the top 0.1%. They're not the top 1%. The top 1% starts at about 150,000. In terms, that's the top 1% of taxpayers start at about 150,000. Sorry, I've forgotten what your first question was now. Our pensions, yes. I can't recall the numbers. I mean, it's quite sensitive. So average. I mean, over the last 30 years, life expectancy has increased at 65 by more than 5 years. It's increased astonishingly fast, and that has had a big effect on the amount that we spend, particularly given not only that formal state pension age hasn't changed, at least for men, it's just beginning to change for women, but actually actual point of movement out of the labour force was going down until the mid-1990s, although it's now beginning to rise and is on and continues on a rising trend, and that matters enormously. Into the more distant future, the impact of increasing state pension age is certainly significant in terms of the public finances. How significant will depend on how many of those people actually are genuinely not dependent on state benefits because they don't go on unemployment benefit or disability benefit or whatever a bit earlier. But it does make I can't remember, it makes a significant and noticeable and important difference to the public finances going forward. And it is almost certainly a core part of dealing with demographic change that we return to a position where it is normal to work into your mid-60s, which it was completely normal up until the mid-1970s. The large majority of men, at least, worked until 65. That's not true at the moment. And with life expectancy at 65 now being well over 80, moving more people working through their late 60s is almost certainly will happen. And almost certainly an important part of happening. Two reasons why I think it will happen. First, we're actually beginning to see it happening. People have been talking about this for a long time, but you're finally seeing it in the data. And secondly, the structure of incentives to do it are changing. So defined benefit schemes, occupational schemes are gradually outside the public sector going. Most people are therefore dependent on their own resources, whether that's in a personal pension or other resources. And so it's expensive to retire early in a way that it didn't used to be expensive to retire early, and I would expect that to begin to have quite an effect as well.
Can I ask a final question and a follow-up really on demographics? The locked-in spending on pensions and the associated costs of an ageing population, non-age-related health spending had that really nice downward curve. What connection or what interaction does that have with a policy goal of reducing immigration to the tens of thousands? Does that seem to be a sensible policy stance given the challenges of ageing? I mean, clearly in the shorter run, if you have an ageing population and your net immigration is among younger people, then that helps the demographic balance. Now, whether that's sustainable forever, I mean, you're forever then running to stand still because you're bringing more and more people in at younger ages to support a growing older population, I think is genuinely open to question. It's also worth saying, a number of older people do retire outside of the country to sunnier climes. Certainly in the short run, higher inward migration helps pay for a bigger, older population. It seems to me a kind of matter of logic that you can't do that forever. So at some point you have to deal with it in other ways. Okay, we are now beyond 7:30, and we need to conclude, sadly. I think Paul has given us the usual IFS authority, the usual IFS accessibility, which I think, given that you come and do this so often, makes you a bit of a national treasure. And I think Jeremy may have some final words in that vein.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to first of all just give apologies to Scotland's Futures Forum and Donald Jarvie for not thanking them at the start, and in my haste to get going, we're really grateful to their continuing support of the Institute, and we love working together with you. And we've got another meeting on Thursday to talk about the programme going forward with the RSE. So thank you, Donald, and Scott, thank you, SFF. Yes, a national treasure, I think that's a lovely thought, up there with Dame Edna Everage, I think. That's perhaps not the best analogy to make. Paul is giving evidence twice tomorrow morning to committees of the Scottish Parliament, first to the Economy Committee and then to the Finance Committee. So I have no doubt that that will be available on BBC Parliament Channel or elsewhere. So I think that'll be well worth taking a sight on. I always take a huge amount out of every presentation I come to by Paul. It is quite amazing the scope, the depth, and the sheer quality of the material that is presented to us. So thank you very much again. I've taken three things that I want to go away and think about, Paul. One is the distributional issues, the way that you referred to the relative skewing of inflation towards the shopping basket of the lower paid relative to the shopping basket of the higher paid, which is leading to an equalization, even though the tax hit has been more to the higher paid. I think actually in the past we worked on the basis that the distribution of consumption was less skewed than the distribution of income because there were effects that offset it. And that looks to be much less the case now and going forward. And that worries me in terms of policy on a variety of areas. And in fact, we've agreed at the Institute to do some work with David Bell and others on that very topic in Scotland. So that I want to go away and think about. Secondly, I want to think about what you said about childcare, because I've always been of the view that selective intervention on early years can be hugely effective in the medium term in dynamic terms. So I think selective intervention makes sense. Universal childcare may not. And I think we need to be very careful to distinguish between the two, because the Finance Committee has for some time thought about early intervention on a number of areas, and I think early years is one area where selective work merits a significant dollop of cash to make sure that does work. It takes time to come through, but there we are. The third issue is, again, looking at the Scottish public finances. Yet again, one realises the importance of oil and gas revenues, and the forecasts there are very different between the Scottish Government and the OBR. Nobody knows who will be right, but the interesting question is the extent to which it is appropriate to take account of higher expectations, however rational they may be, on oil revenues in budget planning, particularly in the event of being treated more as an economy subject to potential volatility because of the dependence on one revenue source. So I think whether the higher revenue expectations are right or not, we need to think very carefully, the Scottish Government needs to think very carefully, the extent to which it takes full account of that in its budget planning, or the extent to which it takes a more conservative approach, which may be appropriate given some of the figures you've given me. So there's a lot in there. I will be going back to the slides. The audio, I hope, will be on our website as well as the slides, so you can go back to that. And I will be looking forward with amazing interest to Paul's evidence, particularly as I have to go to the Economy Committee next week, so I may nick some stuff off you, Paul, for that purposes. But thank you very much. Charlie, thank you very much for chairing it. And thank you all very much for your attendance and for yet again having a remarkable quantity and quality of questions. You never let us down. Thank you all very much.